Now, before I begin writing my actual paper, the first thing I need to do is gather a collection of resources or evidence that I think will validate the claims I plan to make in my paper, and then structure a hook paragraph which hooks the reader or gets their attention, and end that paragraph with a thesis statement that includes both the argument declaration I plan to make in this paper and the map that I will use to guide my reader through each element of the argument that I am making. Remember, before you do this, you will want to have conducted some research so you have some idea what it is you're going to say in that thesis map. So the first thing we need to do is establish a hook. We need to get the reader's attention. And we do that by writing a paragraph that speaks to the reader on some level. There are many different types of hooks. I could use a pathos hook, or one that uses emotion to get the reader's attention. I might tell a sad story about not knowing how to write academic papers before they arrived at college, and I could use a logos hook or a logical hook where I start by listing off some facts and figures about people who enter college or enter academic experiences without prior knowledge of how to structure a paper and how those statistics impact their likelihood of success. I could start out with an ethos hook or an ethical hook, which is where I speak to the ethics or the morality of how we teach students how to write academic papers at varying levels of their career, whether it was high school or whatever came before the moment they're writing the academic paper now. The point of a hook is to get your attention as a reader. So I need to set something up that is attention grabbing. And at the end of that paragraph, I'm going to then write my thesis and thesis map. So let's get that hook written, shall we? Now it's time for us to write our thesis statement and our thesis map. So as you can see from this hook, many people arrive at college unprepared for the rigorous expectations of academic writing. Either they have not been exposed to the world of scholarly writing by their high school or middle school teachers, or they were sick those days and missed out on all the important documentation about structuring an academic paper. Or worse, perhaps they were misled into believing that writing an academic paper could be done without manual research, manual citation generation and checking, or manual structuring, thanks to the use of large language model chat generators, AI, like EasyBib or Citation Generator, to help them create those all-important in-text and bibliographic citations for them. No muss, no fuss. So here we've established a hook, a draw. We are reaching out to readers who have some belief or expectation that they can write an academic paper using tools on the web to construct the structure for them. I am here to tell you, as an expert professor who has this year alone read more than 1,000 academic student papers, that nearly 90% of those papers tried to rely on AI and did not succeed because they did not have the foundational skills necessary to know when AI was misleading them or giving them incorrect information. AI can be a very helpful tool, but only if you know exactly what to look for, only if you know how to identify when it's working for you and when it might be working against you. Because, according to an article that I co-authored in Advances in Online Education, March of 2025, AI is created to generate what is statistically likely to be true, not what is factually true. And that means it can create all sorts of fake, hallucinated citations. It can connect citations that don't make sense. It can mix and match styles, giving you some that are MLA generated and some that are APA generated all in the same paper, making your paper what we would call fundamentally plagiarism. Yes, it's true. Plagiarism is a term we would use to describe a paper that was not cited correctly. So now you can see how very important it is to make sure you understand the foundation of these skills and structure your paper accordingly. Now, in this MLA formatted paper, let's write our thesis. The thesis statement itself is meant to be a declaration, an argument, a statement that is free of self-reflection, free of I statements, and free of reminding the reader that they're reading a paper. There is no need in a paper to say, this paper will discuss, because your readers are smart enough to know that they're reading a paper already. Jump straight into the experience and declare your thesis. Now there's my thesis. This is arguable. It's arguable because other professors, other writers, other readers might think that there's something else that you should do in order to establish academic writing. Maybe it's not about the foundation of research and your succinct exposition. Perhaps it is about simply learning what it means to understand the value of good information, or how to recognize when the information you have is in fact factual and not statistically likely and therefore probably not true. So just to help us remember this thesis, I'm going to go ahead and make it bold. And then I'm going to connect it with the next part, which is the map. Now, a thesis map is often part of the thesis construction that people overlook. The map is like a compass. It is going to name probably about 3 points that I, as a writer, or you as the student writer, will use to summarize the major elements of your argument that this is the way to go when constructing an academic paper. So I would look to my research, I would look to what I've collected and gathered for evidence, and I would establish a path, a line, a trail through my meaning that will get me from this thesis through each idea that backs up my thesis to the conclusion, which restates my thesis and confirms that it is in fact the truth. So let's begin. Academic writing requires us to establish a firm foundation in research and succinct exploration of that research through expository writing. This is where I connect it to the map. So I might use something like as evidenced by. Another way you could say is simply because, or you could say as determined by, or as is supported by, that allow you to effectively bridge your thesis statement, your declaration, to your thesis map. In this case, I've already established 3 things that I plan to do to support this particular thesis. I will begin by saying, so my first piece of evidence is quantitative. I am referring to a statistic, and I will need to refer to evidence that can support my statistic. When I get to the first paragraph after this hook paragraph, I will actually start that first paragraph on the topic of what I have just said, because it's the first part of my map. So basically, I'm saying that I have evidence that suggests that students who do not have this foundation, there's evidence that there is a high percentage of students out there in the world who are receiving a technical plagiarism flag or a plagiarism flag or an academic integrity violation in their first semester of student work. So that's my first piece of evidence. I'm going to have to back that up with evidence that I find, comma, next piece of evidence. So the next area of evidence that I will go to after I've established statistics and an exploration and explanation for preparing an academic writing, the next thing I will do is refer to findings, which is another word for research or evidence, by academic researchers that there is an epidemic of watered down learning seeming to contribute to the coddling of the mind. And there's actually a specific book that I am thinking of from my research stack called The Coddling of the American Mind, which is an academic researcher who has determined that perhaps some of the cause of these forms of papers that we're seeing that lack this structural integrity comes from a well-intentioned but misguided educational source, meaning that the preparation students have received prior to writing their first academic paper may not have been the most effective for the construction of an academic paper. Now I want to make my last point, because remember these points here are just a summary of what will be paragraphs that support my overall argument in the construction of my paper. So the last point I will make in my thesis map will be, and finally, the last part of the map will be the failure of student researchers to recognize a highly valued form of academic evidence versus a popular opinion or biased statement that detracts from their central argument. So here I will be presenting research from likely peer-reviewed journals, because that's the #1 source for high-quality academic research. And I will use that to demonstrate that many students today are writing papers where they reference things like the dictionary or even Wikipedia to potentially popular or biased resources, as opposed to the more academic resources such as textbooks, peer-reviewed journals that appear in anthologies, scholarly resources, but verified bona fide experts, people whose credentials you can confirm yourself through research and exploration. So now we have our thesis and thesis map right here. And this will be what carries us through the paper. The next paragraph in this paper will be a transition from the end of this thesis statement to the very first point that I plan to make, again with lots of research, about the high percentage of students who are receiving that technical plagiarism flag on their student records. So this is how you set up the beginning of an academic paper. Now, remember, it is extremely important that you remember a paper is only complete when it has both an in-text citation and a matching bibliographical citation for every claim you make. If I'm going to be speaking about things like percentages or findings, or again, percentages, because I'll have to speak in some way to the failures that were logged, those are all things that I myself did not create. I have to go outside of myself to the world of research to find that information, and that means it's a claim, and that means it needs to be cited. So before you attempt to write a paper, it is critical that you understand what a source is, what type of source you have, how to cite that particular source, because every source is cited differently, and then how to generate the bibliographical citation that goes with it. This concludes how to set up your first paragraph, your thesis, and your thesis map.